Okay, hold up, stop what you're doing. DJI just released a new standalone transmitter and receiver for you to have a wireless connection. Okay, that doesn't sound very interesting until I tell you that if you use this in conjunction with some of the other products I have available, you could actually get a lens like this, the Tokina Vista Prime, and you can give it autofocus. We'll get there. Now, right out of the box, you're going to get the usual suspects. You're going to get the standalone transmitter, you're going to get the standalone receiver, the cables that you're going to need for it, and you're also going to get an SDI cable that's going to come in this package. Also, you're going to get things like your batteries and the charger and all that other fun stuff. Now, these two are actually a little bit smaller than the Teradek system, but they are bigger than other wireless monitors that I've used before. However, the build quality onto these are great because they feel really sturdy, they're built to last, and you also have a bunch of different options for battery, and you're also going to have the reinforced connection by having 4 antennas on each one. Now, this guy and other DJI products are pretty easy to set up, so make sure you do update the firmware in all your DJI products in order for you to use all the functionality that we're going to talk about in this video. Now, the DJI standalone transmission combo has one of the longest ranges that I've ever seen, and it's written down to actually have a 6-kilometer distance between the transmitter and the receiver. Now, DJI also reports a really low latency, which is only going to be about 7 milliseconds. Now, it's not necessarily a Teradek system, but Teradek systems cost you the same price as, I don't know, a human life. So you're going to be able to pull focus on this guy, or if you want to use it as a client monitor, you can still do that as well, and it's not a gigantic latency between the action and what you're seeing. Now, speaking of actually showing this to clients or showing other people that are going to be on set, whether the control function or the broadcast function, you're actually going to be able to connect the transmission system from DJI to an unlimited amount of receivers in broadcast mode. Now, being able to hook up to an unlimited amount of receivers is actually going to be a really handy tool, especially when you don't want people to breathe over your shoulder and you don't want to find out what they had for breakfast. You could set one of these up to each screen that you're going to have on set, whether you have 2, 3, or 67 of them, and you can make sure that you have enough space for you to get the shot that you need without somebody kind of hovering over your shoulder, which actually is kind of annoying because the pandemic's over, but I still want you to keep 6 feet away from me. Now, one thing that I do like about DJI is that a lot of their components and a lot of their accessory are all compatible with each other. And using the transmitter and the receiver on this as well, you could actually use a couple of different things in order for you to give your cinema camera autofocus no matter what lens you're going to be using. Now, follow me here. Now, the first thing you're going to need to do is you're going to need to have the LiDAR system already, your follow focus motor, and you're going to need the new LiDAR hub that you can get with this setup. On top of that, if you're somebody that does have the high and bright monitor from the original transmission system, you could use the accessories like the handles on the Ronin 4D, or you could actually pick up the standalone focus motor in order for you to control the focus that's going to be used through the LiDAR system. Now, you're probably already going to have your transmitter set up on your camera either using HDMI or SDI and connected to a receiver. But when you are using one of the DJI monitors, you can do this without needing a receiver at all, which means that you actually are going to have a free receiver in order for you to connect this to a client monitor while somebody else pulls focus for you. Now, when you are using the high and bright monitor, which I'm going to use with the Ronin 4D handles, you can go into your menu settings and you can calibrate the lens sort of like how you would if you were using the DJI RS3. That means that you are able to use a LiDAR system with the autofocus without you having to buy a gimbal in exchange. Once you've calibrated your lens and you set a profile for it, you are going to get a picture-in-picture with the little autofocusing square that you're going to see on the DJI LiDAR system. Now, I'm still testing out the RED Komodo X, and I want to put it through some of the real-life situations that I find with different client shoots. So, of course, we're shooting at a gym.
I was doing just enough to get by. I was working on a job. They paid me just enough to keep me from quitting. And I worked just hard enough to keep from getting fired. How many know people like that? Blink your eyes and you understand what I'm talking about. I was pogged. I knew I could do more. But when my mama died, she took something out of me. Said that life is like an onion. You have to peel it one layer at a time. And sometimes you cry. Life's going to happen to you when you have a dream.
So I decided to take everything and put it through its paces in a real life shoot situation, and actually everything performed just fine. Now, I will admit that we did get a little bit catfished in terms of our location, and it was much smaller than what I expected it to be. Now, the reason why I bring that up is because the range test on here was a little bit hard to do. Now, I'm somebody that lives in a gigantic city with a lot of cars and power lines and things like that, so it is really easy to get a lot of obstruction when getting a straight line of sight test in order to find out how far that 6 kilometer is in terms of the transmitter versus the receiver. That I was only able to get about a quarter mile away from my transmitter when I stuffed the receiver in my car and I started to drive off. Now you are gonna have two modes on the transmitter and the receiver. You're gonna have a control mode and you're going to have a broadcast mode. Now the broadcast mode that we talked about before is gonna give you more things to connect to. However, you are going to have a reduced range. So you're not gonna be able to get as far in broadcast mode. However, when you're using control mode, you actually might have less items to hook up to. However, you're gonna get a stronger and a longer connection. However, for me, a quarter of a mile or 370 meters, which is really close to a quarter of a mile, is more than enough distance, and I'm not that far away from my camera, mostly because it's expensive. Now, in terms of the LiDAR focus using this entire system, it actually worked pretty decently, which is kind of scary. I was able to actually use the LiDAR autofocus for some shots, but I also want to use a manual focus to see the latency between the transmitter and the receiver that's already built in the high and bright monitor. And I wasn't pulling focus, I had my buddy Isaac doing it, and he did just fine because a lot of the shots there were completely sharp. Now, in order to get this entire system, there are a couple of different moving parts, but there is one thing that I want to point out, especially when you're setting up the focus motor. Now, what you might want to pick up is going to be one of these guys. Now, this is a 15mm rod to a 12mm rod adapter. Now, what you're going to do for this guy is, because the focus motor from DJI has a 12mm rod input, it doesn't really fit in the standard 15, which I found out the hard way when I was trying to set this guy up. But once I got this set up, I was able to put it in my 15mm rod clamp that's going to be on my cage, and I can connect it just fine by just using this end, and it goes into the focus motor. Something that you might want to keep in mind, and something that you might want to know. Now, I did mention we did use the LiDAR system. We were using it on the Tokina Vista Primes. Now again, this actually worked pretty decently as far as using a autofocus system on a gigantic cinema lens. However, something I might recommend for you is that you might want to use smaller lenses. Oftentimes, when you have big lenses, the big focus rings need a lot of force to actually end up turning the ring, and when you're using a little tiny focus motor like this guy, albeit it works, you might not have as much luck when you're using bigger lenses that might have more stiffer focus rings. So if you are going to use a LiDAR system, you might want to opt for some smaller cinema lenses like the DZO Vespid Primes or whatever have you. Now it's time for the fun part, and we're going to talk about pricing, because these aren't cheap, but they are really highly functional. Now, if you want to pick up the standalone receiver, you're going to be looking at about $16.99. Now, you might want to pick up the standalone receiver because you might already have the transmitter receiver combo where you actually got the monitor instead of another standalone receiver unit. So you might actually be able to not only connect to an external monitor, but you could also use your high and bright monitor to use things like the LiDAR function that's going to come a little bit later. Now, if you do want to get the handles in order to use a LiDAR, those are going to be a separate thing. And as well as you want to make sure that you have the LiDAR Range Finder, the focus motor, and all the other necessary accessories in order to get the LiDAR to work. But there is one thing that's actually the cheapest in this video, and it's going to be the LiDAR hub. This is only going to be about 90 bucks, and you're going to need to connect everything into this hub in order for you to use LiDAR without using a gimbal. On top of that, if you don't want any of the stuff at all and just want a transmitter and receiver, you could pick up the standard combo for $24.99. Now, you might be wondering, $24.99 might be a little bit much in order to get a transmitter and a receiver. And for some of you guys that are looking to save $1, then this might not be the video for you. Now, where the positioning is for this system is going to be more on the higher end budgets and more professional type of shoots. Now, there are going to be cheaper receivers and transmitter setups that are going to be available, but what you might run into is going to be a weakened strength of connection. You might run into some range issues, and you're not going to be able to hook up to a LiDAR system and get all that functionality if you want to expand and move through this ecosystem. Now, if I'm going to make a wild guess in terms of what DJI is setting the system up for, is I think they're actually competing with some of the more professional wireless systems, particularly Teradek. And when you compare the price between all the accessories that you're going to need to get the LiDAR functionality, the transmitter, receiver, and all that other stuff, you're still spending less money than if you had bought a Teradek in the first place, which means that not only are you going to get a more than decent system in order to get wireless transmitting for pulling focus or for client work, you could also give the Tokina Vista Prime autofocus, which is still something that is weird when I say it out loud, but it works. That being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, or at the very least you learned something. Now, wireless transmitter systems, they're not the sexiest thing in the world in terms of camera gear. However, they're incredibly useful on more professional sets, and especially when you have something like a focus puller or clients that you don't want over your shoulder, it actually comes in handy. That being said, I did leave a video somewhere on the screen over there, and a special shout out to DJI for actually sending me the system so I could show you guys how you can give any cinema lens autofocus. I'll see you in the next one. I'm gonna stop talking. Peace.